Hi, you are listening to Baachu Talk, a podcast for government services professionals. My name is Bhaskar Sundram, and I will be sitting down with our government services leaders to share their stories, discuss their career, and learn all about the values and collective impact in our society. Hi, you're listening to Baachu Talk, a podcast for government services professionals. My name is Bhaskar Sundram, and I'll be sitting down with our government leaders, outsourced business leaders, GovTech entrepreneurs, voluntary community, social enterprise leaders, independent policy think tank leaders, and everyone who touches the society to share their stories, discuss their career, and learn all about the values and collective impact in our society. Today's guest is Dawn Austwick. Dawn is the chair of the Kiln Theatre in London and vice chair of the London Marathon Charitable Trust. She is the director of the Food, Farming and the Countryside Commission, FFCC, and a member of the advisory boards of the Institute of Policy Research at the University of Bath and RAND Europe. Wow, that's a lot of roles, Dawn. Dawn was the chief exec of the National Lottery Community Fund from 2013 to 2020, where she was responsible for the effective distribution of the 600 million of national lottery funding each year and for delivering the fund's strategic framework, People in the Lead. Prior to joining the fund, Dawn was chief exec of the Esmée Fairbairn Foundation and was previously deputy director of the British Museum, project director for the Tate Modern, and a principal consultant at KPMG. She began her career in fringe theatre. Wow. She was previously a trustee of the historic royal palaces of the Woodland Trust, and she has MBA from London Business School and an honorary doctorate from London Metropolitan University. She was awarded the Honorary Fellowship by Queen Mary University in 2019, where she also chairs Sketch, student-led initiatives to develop local social enterprises. In his spare time, Dawn does gardening, yoga, and is a dedicated gooner. My God, Dawn, there is so much to talk. Definitely, it's going to take 75 minutes or more, Dawn.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you. Thanks for joining. Dawn, let's talk about where were you born, and let's talk about your high school and education.
Yeah, so I was born in Dore in Sheffield, right on the edge of the beautiful Peak District, where my dad was a lecturer at Sheffield University. So although I'm Yorkshire born and bred, as was my dad and his dad, and back for a long way, we actually moved around a bit, and most of my childhood from the age of 5 was spent in Bath. In the West Country, so quite different to Sheffield. But there is, in the Pennines, there is a village called Austwick. So that just, which was apparently founded by Vikings, because Austwick is derivative from Scandinavian languages. So we do have very deep Yorkshire roots.
There's even a village named after your family. This is amazing.
Well, or it might be the other way around, actually. I think my family took the name of the village, probably.
But either way, that's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah. And so that's good. And from Bath to Sheffield, is it where you did your university as well, University of Bath?
No, I was brought up in Bath and went to school there, and then I came to London to university at the age of 18, and have never left actually since then. Well, I very briefly went back to the West Country for about a year, but I've basically been in London ever since.
Got you. So what was the very first role that you took after your education or during the education? Part-time, full-time, anything?
Well, I had lots of sort of classic sort of studenty late school jobs, working in bars and as a waitress and in shops and all that kind of stuff. I even did a bit of bookkeeping whilst I was a student, which I quite enjoyed actually. Had a little calculator and did some kind of basic bookkeeping for an accountant. But my first sort of proper job after I'd finished at university was for an organisation called the Association for Business Sponsorship of the Arts, and it became known as Arts and Businesses. And this was right back at the beginning of the 1980s. It was 82, 83, and at that point, sponsorship of arts activity by businesses was really quite a new thing, and we were kind of pioneering it. It was quite controversial. A lot of arts organisations didn't feel that it was appropriate for them to receive funding from the business community. So we did quite a lot of sort of proselytising, talking about actually why it could be beneficial, that it wouldn't threaten mission, that it could be additive, etc., etc. So it was a really interesting kind of early role in kind of pushing the boundaries in something. It sounds very uncontroversial these days, but this was, 40 years ago, and it was more of a new thing then.
God, dear. So how long were you there, Dawn?
Well, I was there for about, it was my first job out of university, and I was there for about 2 years. And as is the sort of the kind of habit when you're early in your career, you move faster and sooner. And I decided that I wanted to actually get into the arts proper. My degree had been in English and drama, and theatre had always been a kind of real love of mine. So I got myself a job at a theatre called the Half Moon Theatre, which was in Stepney, on the Mile End Road. And I went there as the business development manager and became the theatre manager. And it was a sort of glorious time because the theatre had built a new theatre, which was and I arrived just at the tail end of that, and as the transition from the old to the new, but hadn't really raised enough money to finish the building. So it had done all sorts of marvellous things, like built the auditorium, but not built any of the stuff that sits back of house, and had run out of money. And we were all incredibly passionate about running a fringe theatre in the East End of London, but we were very we had sort of bare boards and a passion, but we didn't have a lot of financial skill, or management skill, or capital building project skill. So I learned an awful lot there, and it all went a bit pear-shaped. And in the end, a few years after I had left, it actually ended up closing, although the youth theatre remained and remains to this day, actually, and is a fantastic youth theatre in Stepney and Tower Hamlets, and the theatre itself is a pub, although of course closed at the moment because of COVID.
Yes, got you.
Yeah,
fascinating story, especially the amazing experience you got when you were so young. It gave you
absolutely. So you can imagine, you come out of university, and I'd done a theatre degree and an English degree, and I cared hugely about the theatre, was passionate about all sorts of things, but actually I'd never run anything. I'd never really had to sort out budgets or think about how you promote something. So I was very untrained, let's put it that way. But you learn more from your mistakes, I think, than you do from your successes.
Totally. I wouldn't even call it as mistakes. At this point, you do things with what you know.
Yeah.
And gradually, you build up courage, you build up relationships, you build up learnings, and you move from there.
Absolutely right. And you learn masses as you go along. Yeah.
Totally, Don. So from Half Moon Theatre, was KPMG next, or how did you?
Yeah, it was. And very interestingly, this is one of those very funny stories that, which is a real illustration of when you're young, you do things that when you're older, you become far too cautious to do. And one of the things that had been part of my responsibilities at the theatre had been to raise money from the business community. You see the connection with my previous role. And This was around the time an entity called the London Docklands Development Corporation had been set up to help regenerate docklands in the East End of London, which were basically had lost their economic activity. And it was quite a turbulent, difficult time for that part of London. But the Development Corporation was doing some redevelopment, and I had a look at what they were up to and saw that they had some financial advisors. Their financial advisors were called, they were then called Pete Marwick. They became KPMG. So I looked up who was the senior partner. And I picked up the phone and I dialed the switchboard. They were in Blackfriars, their main office. I think it still is actually, or no, it might be in Canary Wharf now actually. And said, "Can I speak to?" And I said the name of this individual, and they put me through. Ooh. Absolutely remarkably. And I said, explained what I was doing, and I said I wondered if they might be able to help with something to do with the theatre. And by glorious serendipity, they were just starting to develop a sort of leisure and tourism practice on the consulting side. So they came and did a bit of free spreadsheet modelling for us, and I got chatting and got to know the individuals. And then maybe 6 months later, I was thinking about this very fact that I didn't really know much about anything. But really wanted to make a difference. So I decided to have a drink with the manager on that assignment, and I said I was thinking about, how could I do this? How could I learn more? And he said, "Well, we're looking to recruit." So I then went through the process of going to work for what became KPMG. And I thought that I had landed on a different planet. If I say just in terms of sort of very very basic things, if I say that when we were at the Half Moon, our office facilities and our general facilities were quite basic, so we used to wait till we went to the pub at lunchtime to go to the loo for a pee. You end up in the city in very nice offices, and you feel in a much more luxurious place of work. But I had 8 years at KPMG, and I did my MBA whilst I was there, and it was the sort of late 80s, early 90s. And I just learned the most phenomenal amount from doing lots and lots of different assignments, lots of clients, great colleagues. And it was that time when we were all in our there are a lot of us in our sort of late 20s, early 30s. I was one of the sort of babies in a sense. And we had a great social life, and a couple of the consultants married each other. We spent a lot of time going out, and some of those people I'm still in contact with today. But it was a really, I learned so much about the sort of skills and knowledge and approach that you need in order to achieve change. Or anything really, in a kind of institutional environment.
Got you. That's the standard. I think it's an ambulance that goes forward. not one podcast is completed without an ambulance or a police car.
I can imagine. Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful. I think you built the courage to call the partner, and then there was a role, and you went through and you built up your entire career. But how was it to move from a small theater into a corporate life? How did you kind of adapt yourself to that environment?
Yeah, it's interesting. So you're right about the sort of making the call and having that sort of chutzpah, the chutzpah of youth, I think, to do that. So when I actually got the job, I was thinking, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? So first thing I had to do, of course, was go and buy some suits. Because I had never owned a suit in my life, or what was in those days called a lady suit, because ladies were also slightly rarer than chaps at that point. So that was also quite interesting. I mean, I kind of cut my teeth with a team who taught me loads, and I both learnt on the job and I got trained. And of course, I did my MBA, and that was an incredibly important part of that transition and learning experience, because I think I'd probably been there a year or two. I'd sort of thought I'd go there for 3 years and then go back into the cultural field. But in fact, I was learning so much and enjoying it so much that I didn't. But what I was conscious of was that if you looked at my CV in comparison with virtually everyone else's CV, I probably looked a bit flaky. You know, I had a degree in English and drama. I did have a maths A level, so I could add up, but you know, it wasn't my favourite subject. And I'd worked in fringe theatre and art sponsorship. So one of the reasons for wanting to do the MBA was to make sure that I had a thorough grounding in business disciplines, but also actually to demonstrate that I was credible. And I think that, and have those 3 letters after my name, particularly from the London Business School, which is obviously one of the best business schools in the world. And I certainly felt that the 3 years that I did that part-time alongside my consulting role really have made a massive difference in terms of acquiring. In the short term, it gave me the credibility I needed. That's been less of an issue sort of latterly, obviously. But it really did give me a great grounding in understanding everything from financial accounting to economic theory to organisation development, you know, marketing, it's decision science, statistics, the lot. So I think all those things, but I learned a lot from colleagues. I think you always learn a lot from colleagues.
Totally. You are in a very corporate consultant-driven environment, which again is intense. People work long, late on assignments. And on top of it, you went on to enroll yourself to do an MBA in one of the most intense programs in the world. And first of all, why did you decide to pursue MBA? Secondly, what advice would you give colleagues who are thinking to pursue an MBA, why they should do this?
Well, I think that, I mean, everyone's got to have their own reasons for wanting to do things. I wanted to do it, as I said, to learn, to ensure that I had that kind of very good grounding across the whole. And the thing I liked about the LBS MBA was that it did cover the full span of business disciplines. It was generalist in that sense. It didn't have a specific focus. And I've always been a generalist. I'm not a specialist. I don't really have a specialism. I don't really have a specialist discipline. And I liked that. And I liked the fact that it would give me that understanding of the whole range of things. And I think I'd say I mean, in those days, I mean, this was a long time ago. This was the late, I think I did it from 88 to 91 or 89 to 91. In those days, they were an awful lot cheaper. You're right, it was very hard work. You know, I still remember my Saturdays sitting at the top of the house here, in what became one of my children's bedrooms, but at that point was my study, and writing my essays. You know, and we did work hard, but we kind of played hard as well. But I think that if you get an MBA, you learn from it, and if you get it from a good business school, it's an imprimatur, and people look at it and say, "Oh yeah, she went there." And so I think it's incredibly useful for your own development, but also in terms of actually some of the doors it can open for you.
Totally. Bring on. So from then on, you just pursued your career in many interesting places, starting from Tate Modern, British Museum, Woodland Trust. Let's go through them in order as quickly as possible.
Yeah. So Tate Modern was just one of those risky things that was too tempting to say no to. So this was in late 94, and I had actually by then had 2 children, and I got a phone call from Nick Throter, who ran the Tate at that point in time, saying, would I be interested in going to be the to run the project to build a new gallery of modern art, which had just been announced in early '94 as a statement of intent by the gallery, and they'd taken an option out on what was the old Bankside power station on the south bank of the Thames. And I had actually just started working for a different consultancy at that point, and I thought I couldn't leave because I'd made this commitment. So I said no. And I went home and told my husband I'd had this phone call, and he said, "Are you crazy? This is a sort of dream job." And I said, "Oh, well, never mind, it's too late. I've said no now." But luckily Nick came back to me and said, would I like to go in and talk about it? At which point I said yes, and then the deal was done. And the deal was really done because I went onto the site, and the Tate were running breakfasts and early morning views of the power station for kind of opinion formers. And I went to one of these, and they took us up on the roof of what was then the derelict power station. And of course, you know, back in the early 1990s, the South Bank of London was not what it is now. It was almost as if London had turned its back on the South Bank and only looked north. But it was a beautiful, beautiful day, very clear, crisp winter morning. The sun was shining, and we stood on the roof, and I looked across the Thames, and there was the most phenomenal view of St. Paul's Cathedral, which is one of my favourite buildings in the world. And I thought, yes, if we can create this gallery in this extraordinary redundant power station, which is architecturally so interesting and monumental, and turn it into a kind of monument to modern and contemporary art. And it sits right opposite St. Paul's. This is going to help really transform London. And I think it was actually going to do that, and that 5 years that transformed my relationship with what is now my home city, because I think it was doing the Tate and feeling that I had made a contribution to London, that it became my town. And before that, I don't know whether I was passing through. I was passing through for a very long time because I arrived in 1979. But the Tate really, that project and the creation of it really grounded me, I think, in feeling that I belonged to London and I was a part of it.
Totally. Don, just a fun fact, that was the very first place my now wife, then my girlfriend, went for my very first date, was the Tate Modern.
Really? Oh, what a brilliant story. That's fantastic. How wonderful. Well, congratulations. I'm so glad. I expect you're probably not the only ones as well.
That's beautiful. Tate Modern, I think that's amazing, because you built up your commercial corporate consulting the career at KPMG. You started in the theatre, had some background, did your MBA, and brought it all together in Tate. How long were you there in Tate, and and what impact did you create? Was there any specific thing that you can share?
Well, I was there I went in 95 to 2000, and I was there till 2000. And my role was absolutely specifically to ensure that we delivered Tate Modern, and that meant that we raised enough money to build it and open it, that we built it to time, to budget, and absolutely to quality, and that we opened it. And I suppose one of the most poignant, joyous moments in my career was probably the opening morning, where we'd had this day before on the 12th of May, I think it was, or maybe it was 11th, can't remember, where we'd had the Queen in the morning, and we'd had Tony Blair as Prime Minister in the evening, and a big party, and it had been absolutely wonderful. But it was opening to the public the next morning, and we all got up, and it transpired that people had arrived very early and had queued. You'll know the building, so you'll know that the ramp down into the turbine hall starts outside, and the doors are like kind of part way down, and people have been queuing down the ramp to come in. And so when we opened the doors at 9:30 or whatever it was, those of us that had worked on the project and been involved in it from the sort of Tate staff, etc., just stood on either side of the ramp and applauded the first visitors in. And for me, that will always be a really just a really sweet moment, because ultimately that's what it was all about. It was about bringing the public into this building to view and explore and understand and appreciate modern and contemporary art, and to revitalise this part of London, alongside all sorts of other wonderful things like the Bridge and the Globe Theatre, etc., etc. So that was a very, very special moment in my whole career, I think.
Definitely. What an impact. So having done that massive opening as a project director for Tate, you moved on to British Museum as deputy director. Was that next role, or was it something in between?
Well, yeah, there was something in between, because I'd actually had, when I went to the Tate, I had a 2-year-old and a 6-month-old, 2 daughters, and then in the middle of the Tate, I had my son arrived. So I had 3 kids, and I wanted to have a bit more time, and I didn't really quite know what I wanted to do next. So I went freelance and worked on various projects and consultancy type assignments for a couple of years, actually. And I enjoyed it, and I liked the fact that I was working less, and I was just at the point of thinking, well, this is all well and good, but am I going to do this for the next 20 years? And the thing that actually was very interesting, and you learn about yourself when you do different things, is that the thing that I really struggled with was the notion that I had to go out and sell myself. I'm not very good at all that sort of stuff. And I wasn't sure. So I enjoyed consultancy assignments and advisory roles, etc. But there were 2 things. One was that, how am I going to carry on kind of working to drum up business, because it won't always just arrive. Do I want to do that? Is it my sort of thing? And then the other part of it was, I was just beginning to think that I missed being in a team.
Yes.
Because I was a sole practitioner, sitting at home in a way, and going off to being part of an organisation for a period of time. But I realised that actually I quite liked belonging in organisations, as opposed to sort of coming in and leaving. So I was just starting to muse on those 2 things, and I got a phone call from the British Museum, and one of the pieces of consultancy had done had been actually for what's now the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and I'd done what was called a quinquennial review of the National Gallery and the National Portrait Gallery. And in the process of doing that, I'd met Neil McGregor, who was then the director of the National Gallery, but had just been appointed the new director of the British Museum. And he was looking for a deputy director. And I was asked if I would apply for it, which I did. And that's how I ended up going to the BM. It was kind of perfect timing for me, and it was 2 things. It was a really interesting role, but also I was incredibly taken with Neil's vision for the museum. And that notion, which has now become so well known, of a museum of the world for the world, with objects from all over the world, and of course that's a contentious subject, but that actually tells stories that actually enable us to explore our own identities, particularly in a city like London, which is so diverse. And also is a city that attracts, well, notwithstanding COVID, attracts people to visit it from all over the world. So it was Neil's compelling vision, and the idea of actually having to do quite a challenging role, because the finances of the museum were not great at that point. So I had to do quite a lot of work in sorting that out.
And how long were you there at the British Museum?
I was there for 3 years,
Wow.
and we did the sort of financial restructuring and the bringing in of a sort of new team and so on. And it was one of those funny things where I'd been on holiday and I came back from holiday, and a headhunter called me up and said, "Oh, we're trying to get in touch with you about a job." And I said, "Oh, what's that?" And I wasn't particularly thinking about anything. And they said, "Well, it's a job running an organisation, and it's this organisation, and we'd really like you to meet the chairman because it's right at the end of the process. And if you're interested, then we'd like to put you onto the shortlist." So I thought, well, okay, I'll go and have a chat, which I did. And very interestingly, I thought, well, this is interesting. I don't really understand this organisation, and I can't feel my way into what I would do if I were running it. But actually, I am quite interested in the idea of being a chief executive. And I'd not been a chief executive before. I'd been a sort of number 2 or a member of a senior team or whatever. So I said no to that and didn't think any more of it. And then the very next weekend, I opened the Sunday Times and there was an advertisement for the chief executive of the Esmée Fairbairn Foundation. And I knew the world of trusts and foundations a little bit, and I knew some of the foundations, and I'd always really admired Esmée Fairbairn. And so I had a little look at the pack and all the rest of it, and thought, yeah, I'd really like to go for this. So I applied. I went through that process and obviously was appointed. So that was it was my first chief exec role, and it was in a completely different sort of environment and world, but with some read across to what I'd been doing before.
Got you. So how was it? Because you built yourself up to a chief exec position, you have multiple experience, multiple sectors, different, what they call learning as well.
Yeah.
So when you took up the chief exec position, was there anything new that you tried, or was there anybody who you took as a role model?
Well, I'd worked with some very, very impressive leaders, obviously, in my previous roles. So I had been watching how people led. But I think one thing that I would say is you always have to adapt and develop your own style and your own approach to the organization that you are joining, and to have an understanding of, if you like, what's the sort of thread of history of this organization? Where has it come from? What's important to it? What's its culture? What are its values? And how do they manifest themselves? And how does it link where it is now to where it's been and where it might want to go to? And how do we ensure that we have that continuity and that understanding? So I think for me, it was an exploration of some of those issues. But the thing that was, there were 2 things that were interesting moving to Esmée, just sort of slightly anecdotal. One was becoming a chief executive, you suddenly realized that people watched you all the time, and that you were much more visible than if you were in another role. And it's that point about leadership and being a figurehead, which is not necessarily a positive thing, but it is the way that we work institutionally, or certainly have done for quite some time, that sort of elevation of the leader, the individual as leader, when ultimately it's actually all about teams. So that was a sort of observation I would make as what's a sort of a significant difference. And of course, as a chief executive, you're also much more alone than you are if you're in a senior management team.
Correct.
And you have this thing called the board, who are probably quite scary, actually, I think, until you kind of get to know them and get to work out how you can work effectively, because you're not accountable to one person, you're accountable to a large group of people, all of whom may have slightly different views. So I think there were those sorts of learning points. And then the other thing that was really interesting going to Esmée was I'd always worked in environments where you either had to raise money, earn money, cut costs. You always had what I would call very strong market levers to hold your organization tightly in terms of its kind of financial performance, or how it was operating and so on. And in the world of foundations, you have to create that discipline yourself, because those market forces don't necessarily exist, particularly if you're a foundation that's endowed. I mean, I did live through in Esmée the extraordinary years of the credit crisis, and not knowing what the impact was going to be on the endowment, and see it fall from, we got up to about 900, I think we got to 968 million before the crash. So we were heading to 1 billion. And of course, we lost 200 or 300 million out of that. So that did have an impact. Of course, it's made it back up in spades since, but it's not the same as being an organization that actually really lives or dies by the money that comes in the door. And that money might walk out the door, as it were. So Tate, when I left, I think 30% of its revenues came from the state. 70% was raised or was self-generated. So with Esmée, we clearly had to face the crisis of the credit crunch in 2008, where we would come in the morning and not be quite sure what was going to happen to our investments. I remember I'd come in every morning and sit down with the finance director, and we'd look at each other, we'd have a cup of coffee and take a deep breath, and particularly wait for the American markets to open and so on. But although we did lose, and we were just shy of 1 billion when we hit the crisis, and obviously lost 200 or 300 million, it's not quite the same as if you're running an institution where you're employing a large number of people, you're very public, and you have to earn your money. And you earn it through either fundraising or through self-generated activity, entrepreneurial activity. So the culture is very different. And so when I was talking about, in order to understand how you're going to lead or what the role is, and the function of the organization, you really need to understand its culture and its history and its ambition and its purpose, and you have to build out and forward from there.
Definitely, what a powerful lesson there. What an amazing journey that you had. And from the foundation, you moved to the Lottery Community Fund.
Yeah.
Yes. That's 7 years there. Managing 600 million pounds. I have only played lottery, but I haven't won.
nor have I, if that's any comfort.
So I think it will be amazing to kind of understand what goes behind. People play lottery, we give the awards to the winners, but what do we do behind the scenes, Dodd?
Yeah, so we at the National Lottery Community Fund receive about 40% of the good cause revenue, and we allocate that money across the United Kingdom, and the strategy of the National Lottery Community Fund was called People in the Lead, and it was very much recognizing that National Lottery money comes from individuals in communities who buy tickets. And the National Lottery Community Fund money goes back into communities, often through very small grants that they make about. I say they because, of course, I've left now, so I'm trying to be they, not we. They make about 12,000 grants a year, and 90% of those are for less than £10,000. But the biggest ones can range right up to a couple of million or above on very particular programs. And the aim is to, through the funding, to enable people and communities to thrive and to realize their dreams and ambitions, or whatever they may be. So they could be very, very varied.
Got you. So was there any memorable community usage that the funds was used that really touched your heart? I'm sure there are many.
Well, the trouble is because is actually picking some, because there are so many wonderful stories. But I'll highlight a couple because they're ones that are kind of particularly meaningful. One of the things I'm most proud of is about 2 years ago, 18 months ago now, we launched a £100 million climate action fund, which was the aim of which was to encourage communities across the UK to take action to address climate change. And that's very much about a community response. So there's lots of people, working to support institutional response or at the policy level. This was very much to try and engage and develop community activity. And before I left, the first round of funding had been allocated and the second was underway. So I feel very pleased and proud of that. Right at the other end of the spectrum, I always loved the sort of tiny, very grassroots grants. There was one project that we funded called the Friendly Bench, which I really liked, which was just started, I think it was in Lincolnshire, but I'm not absolutely sure, where a community just created a very small space with a large bench and a sort of very small community garden around it, for people just to come and sit and talk. And those lovely examples at a very, very human level, I think, are some of the things that really make for flourishing communities. And then if I was to take one other one, because you'll have to indulge me for a moment, it is about probably 2 or 3 years ago, one of the things I loved most about my job was getting out and meeting the grant holders and seeing what they were doing and hearing what was on their minds. And I had a fantastic trip to the Western Isles of Scotland, where we went to Mull, Iona and Ulva. And met some fantastic community leaders doing all sorts of things, from community woodlands to community development to food banks and so on. And one of the projects we visited was on the island of Ulva, which we had helped the community to buy. So from the £100 million Climate Action Fund to working with the Scottish Government on the Scottish Land Fund, and the community had bought the island of Ulva and were aiming to because it had become very depopulated and kind of inactive in all sorts of ways, and the community aim was gradually to bring it back into community use and build up the population, and that was really inspiring, meeting the people who were living and working there.
Just as an outsider, how do we pick and choose what projects we support using the community fund on? Do we have a certain criteria, certain things, or the themes, and the changes frequently? How do we do that?
We have the fund has very open funding programs. There are some very specific ones. So, for example, another program that I talked about, the climate action one, and another one was to develop what's known as leaders with lived experience. So that was a sort of leadership development program for people who came to civil society with a real lived experience to help them develop their leadership skills and take on leadership roles in organizations. And I think that was a very significant piece of work, which is still taking place. But actually, in some ways, the community fund is a little bit sort of form neutral. What it's interested in is, how is the community engaged and involved in making this project happen? Is it a project that's really important to that community? And how is that demonstrated? How is the community represented in the organisation that's going to deliver it, for example? So the sort of golden thread that runs through all the things that get funded is really that relationship with the community and with individual people within that.
Totally. Got close to 40 years of career.
Yeah, I'm quite old, really.
No, I think it's an amazing life. I mean, looking back, you have touched so many people, and you're also part of so many other advisory boards as well. Let's quickly talk through about the Kiln Theatre, the Charitable, the London Marathon, and more, before we kind of loosen up and talk more about you as a person.
Yeah, so I've always liked doing non-exec roles, but when I've been in sort of full-time jobs or more or less full-time jobs, I've only really ever felt I could sort of take one on at a time. And when I went to the National Lottery, I said to myself and to my then chairman that I would do a maximum of 7 years, because that would also coincide with more or less with me being 60. And that's where I got to last year, which is why I finished, because I felt that I didn't want to carry on working full time. I wanted to have a more balanced lifestyle, not least because we now have a grandchild, so I want to see a bit more of them. Well, when we're through COVID, but I wanted to be able to do more non-exec stuff, because I was kind of ready to have a different sort of engagement with organisations, which is you are in some ways, I think, when you're sitting on a board, you are the steward of that organisation on behalf of the organisation. You're there to challenge, support and appoint the senior executive, and to help them, and to be an ambassador for the organisation. And it's a different role, I think, to being a member of the executive team. Now, that probably varies from sector to sector, because most of the boards that I'm on are charitable, and you have a very clear division between the executive and the non-exec. In commercial boards, obviously, you often have mixed boards, so it's a slightly different function. But I enjoy that. I also quite enjoy chairing things, and I like variety. So I now have a portfolio that's quite various, and quite eclectic, but very much suits me.
Yes, London Marathon Charitable Trust. Yeah, let's start from one at a time. Maybe spend like a minute or two.
Yeah.
Let's start with London Marathon Charitable Trust.
So I've just started my second term on that. So I've done three and a half odd years, and I was really attracted to the marathon because I hadn't done any governance roles in the world of sport, and I'm interested in how governance varies across different sectors. And I was also really interested in the model of the marathon, because it's a charitable trust with an operating subsidiary that delivers the major events. And I was also very interested in it, of course, because it's London. And although it organises events that aren't in London, it has grown out of London. And again, it was part of that, being part of my city was one of the other reasons for wanting to do it.
Right. Have you run marathon yourself?
I did say to them that I am not a runner. I quite like cycling, but I'm not a lycra cyclist, if you see what I mean. I'm more of the pottering cyclist. But no, I'm not a runner, I'm afraid.
Well, yeah, I'm sure there are many of my friends who are runners. They just list themselves for marathon and they wait for them to win the lottery. And then there are a few people who do it for fun, and that they get in, and there are professional runners who never are always unlucky on this. But it's a very funny story. So, but the Food Farming Countryside Commission looks more serious.
Yeah, that's more kind of policy wonky, I suppose, in a way, and it harks back to the fact that probably 15 years ago, I was a trustee of the Woodland Trust, and when Esmée Fairbairn is a very strong environmental funder, and we'd had a food strand that we'd developed when I was there. And I've sort of slightly lost touch with that world when I was at the lottery, because it wasn't quite such a key part of what we were doing. So I was really interested in getting back involved in it, and the FFCC has kind of grown out of a commission that the RSA initially undertook and kind of floated off to become its own organisation. And it's really looking at how can we build a future in the countryside, in rural life, that is both economically and ecologically sustainable. How can we encourage the development of agroecology? How can we enable the countryside as nature, as well as people to flourish. And so you're right. It's a more policy driven entity than the marathon, which is very much about operational delivery. So it's the other end of the spectrum.
Got you. The final one, or maybe I didn't miss any more, is this Institute of Policy Research at the University of Bath and Brand Europe. Is it similar?
Yeah, those are both advisory roles where a group of us come together 2 or 3 times a year to just provide feedback and ideas to those particular teams. And again, you're right, they are in the policy field. The one we haven't talked about actually is the Kiln Theatre, which I'm the chair of, which is in Kilburn. And I took on about a year ago now, actually. And of course, ironically, the theatre has been dark for 9 months of the time because of COVID. But just before it went dark, we had the most fantastic play called Passover on, which was a sort of 5-star incredibly powerful piece that I think was described as Waiting for Godot meets Spike Lee, which is not a bad description of it, actually. But for me, it's a coming back to those sort of roots in theatre from a very, very long time ago, but absolutely from that perspective of being the board, the chair, not the deliverer, and trying to support the fantastic team that we have there in the brilliant work they do, producing work that represents and reflects the extraordinary diversity of Brent, which is where it is, and also London, with very high quality work, often new work. So it's a really, really exciting place to be involved with.
Totally, Dawn. I think I don't know how you manage your time. You originally said, I need to kind of, I have children, I let go, but then my God, you had a full on career, and you beautifully managed it. I think if there is anybody who's listening to the podcast, I think what they can get out of this is, in no way, you don't need to compromise your work or life or your passion. You can bring it all together, and you're a beautiful example of what people can achieve in their life and career. But Dawn, thank you for that. So, Dawn, we have talked 50 minutes close to your career, early life and career. Yep. Let's now spend the next 30 plus minutes fast track on you. So tell us 2-3 things not many people know about you.
Well, I think the first one I'd go for is that I'm a bit of an avid consumer of murder mystery books and films and TV series. I particularly like a good conspiracy theory film, ideally with an American president somewhere in there. And I like them to be relatively violence free. I'm not really interested in that sort of slightly more gory end of the market. But people like sort of Jane Casey in Australia, or very traditionally people like Dorothy Sayers, or kind of the US Sarah Paretsky, those sorts of that's my genre really, Mick Herron, etc. So that would be one. Yeah, so I'm definitely not highbrow from that point of view. What would another one be? I gave up meat in 1980 because I thought we were misusing the world's resources. Because I felt that we were producing a lot of grain that we were then feeding to animals in order to eat the animals, whereas if we stopped eating the animals, we could just eat the grain and we wouldn't need as much of it, and haven't eaten meat since. So that's a very long-standing part of me, I think. What would my third one be? I've actually rather enjoyed during the lockdown pottering around Hackney on my bicycle. We've lived here for nearly 31 years now, and I've actually explored my borough in a way that I never have before, and that's been one of the upsides, I think.
That's amazing, Dawn. Let's start from the very first thing that you mentioned. If you are writing your own crime novel with a conspiracy theory, what would be the title and what would be the conspiracy, Dawn?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, given what I've said I'd like, it would have to be a political conspiracy. There'd have to be some sort of cover-up. So maybe we'd just call it cover-up and see what it was. I would probably want to set it in America, in the US, because somehow their political conspiracy theory novels and books are kind of better than ours. I don't quite know why. Maybe it's just the distance, but do you know what I mean?
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. I think my wife, if she listens to this, she'll be nodding the head like 100 times. Yeah, I agree, because that's what she watches. There are so many serials.
Too many.
Name it in all, and then she's just full time binging those things. And now I know why. Maybe she has the passion. That's great. And the second one is, it's so nice to hear that you decided to go vegan in 1980. That's the year I was born. And
well, I'm not vegan, I'm vegetarian, so I do have dairy, but I have less dairy than I used to, actually. And I do eat a bit of fish, but yeah, and absolutely, from my perspective, has always been, it's been about sort of resource management rather than anything else. So it's not very romantic, my vegetarianism.
No, Don, the two-liner that you mentioned to explain why you decided to pursue that was beautiful. It's like, why would we feed the animals the grains so that we feed animals instead we feed the grains is by far the best explanation I ever heard, because the way when I was growing up back in Asia during the 1980s and 90s and even early 2000s, we only eat meat during Sundays. It used to be luxury food. So all 6 days, it's like different types of pulses, different types of, the amount of food that you can have with vegetables and with grains and other things, it's unbelievable. But these days, as you rightly said, the price of a chicken is cheaper than the price of an onion or a tomato these days, which means it just goes the other way around. But that thing is something that I'm sure listeners will pick up, and I personally picked it up as this two-liner, which was super punchy. Pottery and doing the bicycles was great. Again, during the Barclays bike schemes, I was the program director for the Barclays bike schemes. So I understand that when you
were you? Fantastic. Well, I have to admit, I've never used one of those bikes, but that is because I have my own. So I wouldn't quite know how to do it, but they have been fantastic. And it's really interesting to have seen how much cycling has grown in London over the last 25 years. Well, maybe even in the last 10 more than anything. It's been marvelous. I know, I do drive as well, and I know drivers get very irritated with cyclists, and the cyclists get irritated with drivers, and pedestrians get irritated with everybody. But that's the nature of how we have to navigate around a big city, isn't it?
Correct. I think well said on that. That's so nice that you managed to carve yourself out on YouTube. So in addition to that, you also mentioned that you had few hobbies and interests as well. Dawn, let's just touch about those things as well. Gardening, yoga, and what's this Gooner thing?
Gooner, do you not know what a Gooner is? A Gooner is an Arsenal supporter.
Sorry.
So So we live in I live about a mile from where the old Highbury was, and actually probably just over a mile from the new Emirates Stadium. So we are Gooners in our household. Well, some of us are, not all of us. And on a summer's day, if you're in the garden, you can hear either when we score or when we just fail to score, because you can just hear the crowd's intonation. And sometimes I'm there enjoying it, but sometimes I'm in the garden listening.
Gotcha. That's interesting. That's nice. I mean, I after my kids were born, I don't follow football as much as I used to. These days, it's much more into rugby and other things. But yes, I'll come back to that. So gardening and yoga.
Yes. Well, they're I guess my sort of the yoga is really actually about. I started yoga in 2009, 10, because I'd actually had cancer, and I had 6 months of chemo. I think it was 6 months of it was 6 months of chemotherapy, and was very unwell during all of that. And one of my friends said, "Why don't you try a bit of yoga to just start, getting your body back," which I did. and it was fantastic for that. But I also found I got a lot out of it. I very much do. I do what's called Iyengar yoga, which I sometimes describe as sit on your bottom yoga, which it isn't quite, but it's about holding poses for time and exploring with precision. So small movements in your body, and I found that actually it's been fantastic for me, just in terms of fitness, suppleness, just really understanding how minor adjustments in one part of your limb might affect another part of your body, and just being able to explore that wholeness, but at a very kind of micro level. So that's that. I get a lot out of it, basically. I'm making that sound a bit grand, but and I'm not great at it. But you know, it's something that you do for yourself. And it's been great during lockdown because I've done it online, which has been fantastic, actually. And the gardening is sort of similar in a way. It's contemplative, but it's very pleasurable. I very much enjoy weeding. Lots of people enjoy weeding. It's very satisfying. But you know, growing is incredibly satisfying. You know, planting seeds and seeing how much they succeed and learning about why they don't, because quite often they don't. And I've always had immense pleasure, probably for the last 30 years, from gardening. Again, I'm not like a world expert by any stretch of the imagination, but it's something I get a lot out of.
Wow, I think gardening is an entire skill. You know, if 7 to 8 in my diary, there is always yoga sessions, but some year or the other, some year or the other, I do. As you know, it's a group training with my yoga teacher. I do miss out. The point is, around 8:30 in my local park, my yoga teacher normally goes for a walk, and that's the park that I cross to get into my office. It's only 15-minute walk.
Yeah.
So every single time when I miss the class, it's the same day where I actually bump into her in the park. I don't know why. The days that I actually do, I always look for, hey, come and ask me now. I just it always ends up the other day, and you always see that look. But yeah, tomorrow I will attend my yoga class, and I'll be thinking of you, Dawn. That's great. Dawn, the next 10 minutes, it's what we call a rapid random fire question round. It just goes bonkers, so don't think too much. Anything comes in your mind is the answer. No, that's it.
Okay.
So, what trait do you like the most about yourself?
Possibly sense of humor.
Yes,
being able to look on the bright side.
100%, totally. What is your favorite childhood memory?
I think being on the beach in Devon when the sun sets, after a lovely day with the family, digging sandcastles and collecting shells and things.
If you could be invisible for a day, what would you do?
If I could be invisible for a day, what would I do? Do you know, I might go back in history and be a fly on the wall. Actually, no, I know what I'd do. I'd go back to, I would be really interested to understand how our prehistoric predecessors lived. So I'd go back to the time of cave people and try and see how that society world, and just be that fly on the wall with them.
Perfect. And if you go back to history, which historical character would you like to meet and why?
Oh, I think that would have to be Mary Wollstonecraft at the moment, because I think she's a fascinating person. I think that she had an extraordinarily varied and adventurous life, that she was a woman of principle, she was a philosopher, she wrote fiction, she lived according to her beliefs, she spent time in Paris during the French Revolution and navigated her way through that. She died very early at the age of 38. I think she's a fascinating character, and of course have a sort of slight local connection because she lived in Newington Green, which isn't far from where I live, and of course a statue to her has finally been erected in Newington Green and has been the cause of much controversy recently. So I would love to go back in history and meet her.
Brilliant, brilliant. So do you ever talk to yourself? If so, what do you say?
I don't really talk to myself, you know. I do talk to my plants, but I talk to my plants about gardening things, which is really not very interesting for anyone else, let alone the plants.
Got you. Do you have a memorable kitchen fail?
I have a very funny story that probably about 20 years ago, we had some people round to dinner. One of whom was a very, very well-known person in the media industry, who we kind of knew peripherally but not very well, and we'd invited them round to dinner because a couple of their children had come to live in Hackney, and they thought Hackney was a very odd place to live, and we said, well, we don't think so. We love it here. Anyway, they came round to dinner, and I made a chocolate mousse as a pudding. And I'd put it to set somewhere. And what had happened, unbeknownst to me, is we'd had a tin of batteries.
Oh, no.
And they had fallen out of the tin and into my setting chocolate mousse. So our pudding was chocolate mousse with batteries. You know, AAA, AA, and all the rest of it. I can't believe it. I die with embarrassment to think about it. But yeah, that's my kitchen disaster. There have been many others, but that's probably the most embarrassing.
That's interesting. You know, I haven't tried it, but I always read that the illegal way of making an alcohol, like in good old times back in South India, they used to put batteries inside.
Really? Oh, well, maybe I'd made an alcoholic chocolate mousse as well. But anyway,
exactly.
Yeah.
There is something that's in the chemical.
Thank you for making me feel better about it.
Exactly. You might have tried a different, like what do you call this chocolate alcohol thing that's in Ireland? I forgot the name now.
Oh, a liqueur. A chocolate liqueur, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly. That's it. Next time you could talk it as a. No, I did try chocolate liqueur.
Yeah.
It's a good one. It's a good one. So, if there is a fight between Superman and Batman, who do you think will win the battle?
Oh, do you know, I'm really not into superheroes, so am I allowed to say I don't really care? Sorry.
That's a good one. That's a good one. So, what song is in your playlist that you listen to all the time, and what memories does it bring back?
Oh, I have so many because music is such a formative thing, isn't it? I mean, all sorts of jazz. I from kind of John Coltrane and Miles Davis and Art Blakey, Keith Jarrett. But one song, I don't play it very often, but probably has a massive meaning, would be The Clash's London Calling, because it comes from that time in my life, the sort of very late 70s, early 80s, when I was leaving my West Country home and becoming a Londoner. It was that sort of explosion of punk. And the world was just opening up for me in the most extraordinary way, going to study drama and meeting all these new people and being in London. And I fell in with a crowd of kind of sociology students, and it was just a complete opening up of a new world from what had been quite a sheltered upbringing. And that is probably the song that's most emblematic from that time.
Oh, that's so nice. That's so nice. So we are in this COVID environment now. Is there any stories that inspired you personally, or what kind or thoughtful thing someone did to you personally, or something that you find it really heartwarming?
Well, during the first lockdown and the schools were shut, some of the teachers, and I'm sure teachers have done this from many schools, but I heard about this from one of our local primary schools. The teachers were worried about some of their pupils, so they decided that they would distribute food parcels to them and their families, and not only did they do that, so as well as trying to sort out being kind of remote learning and all the rest of it, but they used it as an opportunity to knock on the door and have a chat and make sure they were all right. And I just thought, what amazing dedicated public service from those individuals, because they didn't have to do that. They could have just, as it were, done their job, but they chose to do so much more. And I think one of the things that has happened across the whole country in COVID is that there have been so many of those small acts of kindness and looking after each other. We're a street that now has a WhatsApp group that didn't have it before, and people are doing far more talking to each other. If I think in a kind of completely different context of the village my mother lives in, the lockdown came and they divided the village up into quadrants, and each quadrant had someone who was going to make sure that everybody in that quadrant had enough food, and if they didn't, or if they needed anything, they would arrange the shopping for them. It was kind of military precision, but it was about looking after each other, and I think you can find that everywhere, and it's incredibly heartwarming.
So we are in the last 10-12 minutes of the podcast. Let's just look back in your career and life and talk about who are the people who have been the most influential in your life and career.
Well, I think the people who've been most influential in my life overall have got to be my parents and my husband and my kids, probably, actually. And my parents, I think, because of the way they brought me up and because of the people they are or were, because my dad died this time last year. My husband, because he's just a rock in my life, and he comes up with very sage advice when I seek it, and probably my kids, because kids are absolutely brilliant at taking the mickey out of you.
Totally.
Totally. It's very grounding. It's great. Even though they're all in their 20s now, they still do it, and good for them.
Yes, that's so nice. That's so nice of you. So, if you look back at all the relationship that you have in your life, who is the kindest person you know?
Apart from my husband, I think maybe my friend Sue, actually. Who's just a very old friend and has huge emotional intelligence, combined with, she's always the one to send the card or to offer the food, or to be thinking about how someone's upset and why they're upset and what you can do about it. So yeah, I think probably my friend Sue.
Nice. Everybody needs a Sue Dong.
Yes, absolutely right.
That's nice. So what's the biggest lesson life has taught you so far?
Oh, well, I think there's so many. I think a really good, apart from always see the best in people, because 99.99999% of people are fundamentally good, and 99.9% of people's actions are with the best of intent. So we mustn't judge everybody by the worst. We must judge them by the best. But I think if I was being a sort of slightly more sort of low key, I'd say think twice. I remember in my very first job, my very first boss, proper office job, a man called Luke Rittner, who I'm very fond of, and he had a letter that came in that made him cross. And he dictated a letter back in reply, and then he said, I think that's one that we're going to sleep on. So we put it in the drawer, and we didn't send it the next day. And I thought that's very, very wise, because it's just always worth a bit of reflection. Sometimes you have to act, but when you don't, it's worth a bit of reflection.
Oh, wow. It's very powerful. So I was about to ask you, what advice would you give anybody who's wanting to pursue a career similar to yours?
I would say follow your heart and follow your instinct, and don't plan too much.
I think looking at your career, Dawn, is there anything that you planned that worked, or or you just went with the flow?
No, I don't think I kind of planned any of it. Each step led to the next step, actually. No.
Yes, that's super powerful, super powerful. Thank you, Dawn. Dawn, what's one thing you wish you had known when you began your career?
I think when you start your career, things seem quite simple in some ways. And I think they're actually quite complicated. So maybe thinking a bit more about complexity.
That's nice, Dawn. Dawn, if we reflect back, that young girl who started a career in Half Moon Theatre, KPMG, Tate Modern, British Museum, Woodland Trust, Esmée Fairbairn Foundation, then non-exec positions in between the community fund, Kiln Theatre. What's next for you? What are you looking forward in the future?
Lots of things. I'm looking forward to sitting on a beach in a warm place. I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into the non-exec roles I've got, and maybe seeing one or two others that might come my way. You never know. And actually, I'm looking forward to. I'm doing a tiny little bit of sort of mentoring and coaching, just a bit of that, because I enjoy that a lot. Sharing things that have been useful to me on my journey, and in that way sort of giving a little bit back. I don't really have any ambitions in that sense, just things that I might enjoy doing and might be useful to others.
Perfect, Dawn. Totally, Dawn. Dawn, we talk close to 75 minutes, but is there any part of your life or career, or is there anything else you would like to say to the listeners before we close?
Oh goodness, no. I think I just reiterate my, follow your instinct and your gut. And I suppose the other thing is just stick with your moral code. Don't compromise, or understand where your red lines are, because I think you can compromise, but you need to understand where if you did, you'd be crossing a personal red line.
Wow, that's a very powerful end to the episode, Dawn. Dawn, thank you so much for joining today. It's been an absolute privilege to have you with us at Baachu Talk. Wish you, your colleagues, your family, and everybody whom you'll be touching all the good health and happiness. Please do continue to inspire everybody. Stay healthy, stay happy, and keep in touch, Dawn. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Very nice to talk to you.
To our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Please do visit baachu.com/Baachu Talk podcast to this specific episode link to everything that was mentioned in this episode. Don't forget to subscribe, review, and share Baachu Talk podcast with your loved ones. We will see you at the next episode with another special guest. Until then, it's Bhaskar Sundram from Baachu signing off.